At long last, it is the day you've been waiting for. We get to look at the structures of the 20 common amino acids. We're going to draw each and every one of them. And the best thing about amino acids is quite simply that they are like people. Every single one of them has its own personality, and each and every one of them has some environment, a regional location within a protein in which they most thrive, in which they are most accommodated. So we will keep that in mind as we look at every one of their structures. But before we dive in and start drawing these structures, I want you to recognize that the projections that we're using are Fisher projections. So rather than having to draw all of the stereochemistry, in a Fisher projection, that is implied. So the bonds that are horizontal, we can always assume are coming out of the page at you, and the bonds that are vertical, please assume that those go into the page vertically. The vertical bonds go back into the page away from you. So that gives the stereochemistry that we would expect around, in this case, that central alpha carbon. As we begin to draw the structures, let's begin with the simplest of the structures. This one is glycine. Glycine, remember, is one that we already began to meet, and we recall that it is the only achiral amino acid because it has only 3 substituent groups around the alpha carbon, so the hydrogen is repeating. The simple hydrogen, however, gives glycine an incredible personality of being ultra flexible. It can get into tight spaces. So glycine's 3-letter abbreviation is GLY. Its 1-letter abbreviation is G. Now, I recommend that you draw all of these out, you promptly take your notes and post them somewhere where you look all the time. Maybe it's above your sink where you do dishes all of the time. Maybe it's, in your bedroom where you lie around all the time. I don't know, maybe it's in front of your toilet. Wherever it is that allows you to frequently see these and frequently study these and learn them, that is where you want them to be. Notice too that the alpha carbon in this is achiral. It's not chiral. It's the only amino acid like that. And notice that this fits into small spaces. It is flexy. It can be in tight turns, in tight places. We know people like that who thrive in those tight spaces. So it, in that way, can accommodate, there is no other amino acid that can be accommodated in those really small and tight spaces. Alanine is little too. Alanine is got a simple methyl group as its R group. ALA's 3-letter abbreviation, ALA, quite straightforward, and its 1-letter abbreviation equally as straightforward is simply an A. So as we start to recognize that we're looking at aliphatic R groups, aliphatic R groups are those that have hydrocarbons that are either linear or branched, or in one case that we'll look at, the branch kind of wraps back around and forms a little bit of a ring. So we begin to see that with alanine we're looking at the simplest hydrocarbon. Valine becomes a little bit more complicated. But valine is super easy to remember because its R group actually forms a V. Check that. Now, when we begin to start seeing hydrocarbons accumulated, these non-polar carbon-hydrogen bonds, we can think to ourselves that this amino acid probably really hates water. So its personality is very highly hydrophobic. So Val, V, it's going to want to live in a landlocked state, right? It doesn't like much to be around water. So it is very highly hydrophobic. Water hater. And the next of our amino acids are also very highly hydrophobic. Leucine even more so than valine because you add yet another hydrocarbon in its R group. So rather than having just the simple 3, it has 4 hydrocarbons, a very similar structure to valine, only there is an additional carbon bound to 2 hydrogens here in the beta position, so the beta carbon. Now leucine has a 1-letter abbreviation of L and a 3-letter abbreviation of LEU. Makes a lot of sense. It's another highly hydrophobic amino acid, so we can jot that down. Highly hydrophobic. I have a shorthand that I use for that. I just go like this. With like a 0 with a slash through it. It just means highly water hating. No water. No water. So we're going to leave it at that because it's helpful to have a little bit of extra room here. Now, isoleucine, this is a really special amino acid because it's a lot like leucine, only the branch takes place up above. So we actually will recognize it as having an extra carbon branched off of its beta carbon rather than gamma. So this is what we're looking at for isoleucine. Now, isoleucine is clearly also highly hydrophobic, but it's a super fascinating amino acid, the first one that we've met that actually has two, not just one, but two chiral carbon centers. So notice this, I'm going to put a star by both of the chiral carbon centers. Of course, the alpha carbon, but so too the beta carbon. Both of them are chiral. So that being said, let's take just a minute to look at the 4, not just 2, but 4 stereoisomers of isoleucine. And you're getting the chance to meet my cat, Gabby. Gabby is making sure to make my job difficult of writing stereoisomers, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to forge ahead, difficulty accepted, and take a look at all 4 of these different stereoisomers. Let's begin by just simply drawing isoleucine, recalling that, of course, it has its typical alpha carbon, carboxyl and hydrogen, but then as we get into the R group, recalling that we had the methyl group attached to the beta carbon, and then the remainder of the R group. Beautiful. Let's go ahead then and note, as we already are aware, that this is L-isoleucine, as is true with all of our common 20 standard amino acids. But hey, look at that. We can now write the D stereoisomer or D enantiomer of isoleucine. So we know that's the second of our stereoisomers. So our D stereoisomer taking shape. Beautiful. But then, of course, we also know that there's stereochemistry around the beta carbon. So we can go ahead and write the other variation here, which is something called Alla-isoleucine. So recognize then that this is Allo-isoleucine. So I'm going to go ahead and try to fit the name of that down here. Allo-isoleucine. And then across our mirror plane, and there we have it, our D-allo-isoleucine. So all 4 of our possible stereoisomers of isoleucine all in one spot. Kind of overwhelming, but it's truly beautiful. Let's now return to our main notes and write down the 1 and 3 letter abbreviations for isoleucine. They're fairly straightforward, though the 3-letter abbreviation has a little nuance. It's ILE and then I. Again, as you're guessing, highly hydrophobic. So if valine likes a landlocked state, maybe isoleucine and leucine like a state without even any lakes in it. So let's look at proline. Now let me tell you, if I have a, second favorite, let's say it this way, if I were an amino acid, I would want to be proline because quite simply it is so dang kinky. It has a beta carbon that then binds to a somewhat in a somewhat kinked way, because let me show you why. So beta gamma delta, and check this carbon binds back to the nitrogen. So this actually literally induces a ring type structure in the proline, and as you might imagine, this amino acid, wherever it might find itself within a protein, would introduce an abrupt direction change. That is, it would introduce a kink. So proline, PRO, 3-letter, P, 1-letter, restricts geometry and often introduces abrupt direction changes. As we turn our attention to the aromatic R groups, we'll begin with the simplest, phenylalanine. And in phenylalanine, the R group is quite simply a benzene ring. It will serve us well to recall our organic chemistry and the highly delocalized pi electron structure that we see within a benzene ring. Phenylalanine has a 3-letter abbreviation that you won't find particularly surprising. However, because we know that proline has already taken the P, F is going to be the 1-letter abbreviation for phenylalanine. One might readily assume that this is going to be very highly hydrophobic, and you would be absolutely correct. Lots of hydrocarbons. In fact, as we start thinking about things like benzene, we know that these are things that remind us of fuels or oils, and of course are very highly water-hating. The next one we'll look at is tyrosine, which looks very similar to phenylalanine, only it actually has a hydroxyl group in the para position of the ring. Hopefully that rings a bell, para position. And tyrosine has a 3-letter abbreviation that also makes sense. However, its 1-letter abbreviation is a Y, which is a little bit harder to remember. We do recall back to our earlier discussion about the fact that the more OH groups, the more polar OH groups you add to a chain of hydrocarbons, the more you increase its hydrophilicity, or its love of water. So recognize that tyrosine will be less hydrophobic, so the OH makes tyrosine a phenol. It is a phenolic, and it decreases the hydrophobicity. Less hydrophobic than phenylalanine. Let's look now at tryptophan, which I often joke is got such a big R group that you might literally trip over it. Tryptophan is a slightly more complex R group. This is attached to a 6-membered ring, all with highly delocalized pi electron structure. And that is, of course, the name of the game. And so recognize that that position there is a nitrogen. That's a little bit tricky to draw. So pi electron structure is the name of the game when it comes to these aromatic amino acids with strange 1-letter abbreviations. Tryptophan is W. It too is highly hydrophobic, as you might guess. And we recognize that this high pi structure, pi electron structure, the high delocalization, causes these amino acids to absorb light at wavelengths within the UV. So both tyrosine and tryptophan both absorb UV light at 280 nanometers. Thus, protein concentration can be determined by reading what we call A280s. Now, this is super applied. So say that you're working with a protein and you want to isolate that protein from a particular organism, a particular cell. Perhaps you lyse that cell, it releases its proteins, maybe you're able to partially purify the protein through dialysis, and then maybe you use some sort of chromatography to purify that protein further, and you want to know the concentration of the purified protein. You can look to read A280 readings, looking at a UV spectrophotometer that will measure light absorbance and will therefore tell you how concentrated your protein is in solution based upon the concentrations of tyrosine and tryptophan because they absorb the UV light at 280 nanometers. Before we leave the aromatic amino acids behind, I want to briefly draw your attention to the hydroxyl group again and tyrosine. And notice that although it is not ionized at typical physiological pHs, if you were to raise the pH to a higher, more alkaline pH, you might expect that there's a possibility that this hydrogen ion would actually be extracted from the OH, and that we would actually see that this could become reactive and maybe it participate in some sort of whether it be acid-base catalysis or some sort of nucleophilic attack, that the hydroxyl could become reactive if the hydrogen ion were extracted at high pHs. And in a cell, within an enzyme, we could see that locally that may be made possible by local electronic environment. And so that's something to bear in mind and keep in mind. So we're going to turn our attention now to looking at the sulfur-containing R groups. We have some truly exceptional amino acids. Methionine is fantastic because it contains a thioether. So I hope everybody has been reviewing the OChem review that I sent to you, and that you have reviewed what an ether looks like, recalling that it has this structure. If we have a thioether, then a sulfur replaces that oxygen. So a thioether would look like this. And methionine is famous for having a thioether. So it actually has an R group in which we see a CH2 bond S, bond CH2, bond CH3. Hey, another highly hydrophobic amino acid with a thioether. And a straightforward 1 and 3 letter abbreviation, MET and M. My pen likes to change color on me sometimes, so get used to it. It's black and blue. So recognizing then that methionine has a thioether. Now cysteine has a fantastic functional group as well. It has a CH2 bond SH. So we can recognize this sulfhydryl in the cysteine group, but also, just as we talked about looking at tyrosine, this SH group can become ionized. That is, it can lose its acidic proton, and it can actually act in a very reactive way. It can be involved in acid-base catalysis. It can most certainly lose that proton at more alkaline pHs primarily. So cysteine, again, 1 letter abbreviation and 3 letter abbreviation make quite a lot of sense. It is slightly or somewhat hydrophobic. It is highly reactive, and it can form weak hydrogen bonds. And it can act as an acid. It can become ionized. And we're going to see at the active site of enzymes, sometimes cysteine is going to get into the action. It's going to get a little bit jazzed about being able to act in a fairly reactive way at the active site of enzymes. So just as we saw a thioether in the R group of methionine, what we're recognizing that we see is a thiol. We see a thiol in the R group of cysteine, so a thioether and a thiol. Those are our sulfur-containing R groups. Now, we need to spend a little more time with cysteine because not only does it end up being reactive in maybe enzymatics, but it also is incredibly important in protein three-dimensional structure. So when we think about if two cysteine R groups in 3D space came close to one another, if we saw in the overall tertiary structure when a protein wraps around and folds, if two cysteine R groups come close to one another and the pH is slightly alkaline, then the sulfur can the two sulfurs in the neighboring cysteines can bind to one another, and it forms something that we call a cysteine, or more commonly called a disulfide bond. Disulfide bonds are incredibly important in overall 3D structure of proteins. What I've done to go ahead and show you the formation of a cysteine, or better known as a disulfide bond, is to show two cysteine residues that are close to one another in three-dimensional space. And so that will open up the possibility for the sulfurs to react with one another upon oxidation. So at a slightly alkaline pH, they will be prone to oxidation. And we will see then the formation, and I'm just going to draw the R groups here, of the cysteine or disulfide bond. Now, these are very, very common in protein three-dimensional structure maintenance. You can imagine that once a protein collapses via hydrophobic collapse, and suddenly these cysteine residues are found in local neighborhoods in a slightly alkaline pH, these can be very pivotal in sort of forming the safety pins or crochet hooks that knit together protein three-dimensional structures. We're now ready to talk about those amino acids that have alcohols in their R groups, and we'll begin with the simple serine, and serine has a CH2 bound to a hydroxyl, so the R group just appears like this, and immediately when you look at serine, you'll think about the fact that it is definitely water-loving. It's not the most highly hydrophilic amino acid that we'll encounter, but it is a water lover. Its three-letter abbreviation is really quite straightforward. It's just SER. Its one-letter abbreviation additionally makes a lot of sense, serine. And so we recognize that it is very polar, very water-loving. It's not ionized, however, so it doesn't have the super strong interactions with water that we would see for an ionized R group, but it is still polar, and definitely we could foresee a situation in which it would exist on a more superficial portion of a protein where it might interact and hydrogen bond with other water-loving species. So it usually doesn't ionize, that is, it isn't likely to lose its acidic proton, but sometimes at the active site of an enzyme, you might foresee a situation where the local electronic environment was such that something acted as a super strong base and could extract that proton, leaving the ionized form of the oxygen, and then it can react as if it were ionized. So the way we'll say that is it generally does not ionize in aqueous solution, but it can react at the site of many enzymes as though it were ionized. And we'll actually get to see that happening when we start talking about enzyme chemistry. So that's a pretty cool R group. And particularly depending upon the environment that surrounds it, it can act in some unique ways. Let's also look at threonine. So threonine is another alcohol-containing R group, but this one is going to immediately catch your eye because you're recognizing, and I'm setting you up to recognize, that the beta carbon in in threonine is also chiral. So not only are we seeing a chiral alpha carbon, but additionally a chiral beta carbon, and I challenge you to go ahead and write all of the stereoisomers for threonine. Threonine also, like serine, has a very straightforward 3-letter and 1-letter abbreviation. And it's cool that we can write down right here that it has a second chiral carbon. Before we leave this behind, please remember to also write down that threonine as additionally is polar and hydrophilic. Great. We'll go ahead and move along and look at our basic amino acids, beginning with my absolute favorite amino acid, histidine. Now, the nice thing about histidine, well, there's really multiple nice things about histidine, but one of them is that it has a simple and straightforward 1-letter and 3-letter abbreviation. So as you might guess, it's just HIS as its 3-letter abbreviation and just a simple H for its 1-letter abbreviation. Because it often carries a charge in its R group, it is very highly hydrophilic, but additionally it's also full of polar bonds, so it's very much a water lover. It can go between two forms, its conjugate base and its acid. Its acidic form, or its if you will, its protonated form is called the imidazolium ion, and its conjugate base is called imidazole. And it actually, the reason that we talk so freely about the two is because they do very much equilibrate with one another in a pH that you would expect to see within the cell. That is to say that the pKa of histidine is extremely near neutral. And because of that, histidine is a promiscuous proton proprietor. That's my fancy way of saying it's kind of a proton slut. It gives and takes and gives and takes and gives and takes of protons, making it extremely reactive and very, very much an important part of the active site of so very many enzymes. So you can see why I say that histidine is absolutely, bar none, my favorite amino acid. Let's draw first the imidazole form and take a look at that. And this is a nitrogen containing ring structure, and I'll be honest, it's one of the trickier amino acids to remember and to really get your mind around how to exactly draw the structure. So we have two nitrogens within a 5-membered ring. And I'm trying to get this beautiful ring structure shown, and also to indicate the resonance, so you can see a double bond here and here. And in this particular case, notice that we have the conjugate base form. That is, we are recognizing that this is the imidazole form. But we could equally well draw, and I'm just going to draw a second R group so you can look at what the imidazolium ion will look like. Because this nitrogen can very easily become protonated, so this can be an NH, which means then that we get the interesting delocalization. Excuse the line there is really not very good, but we get the delocalization of electrons across those two bonds, and we recognize that this will carry a positive charge. So here's the interesting thing. This imidazolium form, the positive charged form, and the imidazole form, remember that the pKa for histidine is approximately 6. So if we're thinking that we actually are in a cell, and my kitty Gabby is getting into the picture here today, but if we're thinking that we really are within a cellular pH about 7.3 physiological, then we're going to recognize that the form that we would would expect to exist in that pH would be the imidazole form, that it has gone beyond its pKa and has lost its acidic proton. However, also recognize that this being so very near neutral is what's going to enable histidine to be constantly shifting and ebbing and changing and fluxing at the active site of an enzyme, where it can literally give up and take and give up and take a proton. So this is a really, really meaningful, really, this is super active amino acid. So absolutely adore it. I'm going to leave those two forms so that you can take a look at both while we go on to talk about another basic amino acid. While not quite as stunning as histidine, lysine is pretty radtastic. It has not just, so an alpha, but not just a beta, it has a gamma, but don't stop there, a delta, and don't stop there, an epsilon carbon. Look at that long chain. Now, if it weren't for the fact that on the very end of that chain there is an amino group, we would be able to say that lysine was really highly hydrophobic. But check it out, now there's this amino group at the very end of the long chain of carbons, and so we recognize that it is going to be a very, very water-loving instead of water-hating amino acid due to the charge and, of course, the ion-dipole interactions that are enabled with it and water. Lysine has a straightforward 3-letter abbreviation, but it has a really complicated 1-letter abbreviation. So K is its 1-letter abbreviation, lys or LYS is its 3-letter abbreviation. We know that it carries a positive charge at neutral pH. And we also can recognize that, hey, check this. This is not just an amino acid, this is a diamino acid, because notice that not only do we have the alpha amino, so this is the alpha amino, but we also have not a beta, not a gamma, not a delta, that's a bad delta, there we go, okay, yes, an epsilon. So this is a diamino acid with both an alpha and an epsilon amino group. So this is a diamino acid, and we want to write that in too. Now arginine, it might be like my 3rd favorite amino acid, because let's face it, it's the pirate amino acid, arg. Yes. And it has kind of a weird 1-letter abbreviation. It's R. Arg. So recognize the R group here as being similar to lysine. There's a beta carbon, there's a gamma carbon, there's a delta carbon, and then from there there's a bond to nitrogen. And this nitrogen is then bound to another carbon that's going to be a central carbon, which then at this point, this is doubly bound to a nitrogen. This is positively charged, and then again we have another nitrogen here. And so what's really cool and probably incredibly fitting for our pyro amino acid is that it is the most base of them all. So it honestly is the most basic amino acid that there is. What that means is that under every pH that is found within a cellular system, this amino acid will be protonated. That is said another way. Its pKa is so high that it is always going to be below the pKa, and therefore it's going to maintain its acidic proton at all pHs that are relevant within a cellular world. Which we understand that that probably means that it's going to make a very large contribution to the overall charge of proteins, and namely to the negative charge. If we see a protein that is rich in arginine, we can say that it is going to be likely to be a basic protein. Beautiful. So these are our basic amino acids, and I don't want to leave out the acidic amino acids, so we'll turn our attention next to looking at those. So as we now move along to look at the acidic amino acids, one feature that I want to mention is conserved is that, like the basic amino acids, these are going to be highly water loving, very highly hydrophilic. And actually make sure you write that back on your notes for ARG, the basic amino acid. The pyrite amino acid is also very highly water loving, as are going to be our acidic amino acids, aspartate and glutamate. Because they have charged R groups, they are going to be incredibly interactive with water, forming those ion dipole interactions. So let's go ahead and draw the R groups of the acidic amino acids, beginning with aspartate. Aspartate has a relatively simple R group. It's got a CH2 bound to a carboxyl group. So C double bond O, bond O minus. No, look at this. This is a dicarboxylic acid, because not only do we have our carboxylic acid group on the alpha carbon, but there's another one on the beta carbon. So aspartate, with its three-letter abbreviation making an awful lot of sense, it's just ASP, has a one-letter abbreviation that leaves us a little bit dumbfounded. It's D. So aspartate is a little bit unusual in that way. It's, of course, going to love to form interactions with surrounding water molecules, very highly hydrophilic, very polar, and negatively charged at a pH of 7. Now this is going to be true for nearly every cellular pH, because the pKa of aspartate is down near 3, and of course because of that, at most pHs that you would encounter in a cellular environment, most neutral pHs, this is going to be in its anionic form, negatively charged. However, I suppose if you saw an environment that became acidic enough, if we thought about, like, say, your stomach, then this could cause it to become protonated. Again, it is a dicarboxylic acid with both an alpha and a beta carboxyl group. Now let's go ahead and take a look at glutamate. Glutamate is very, very similar to aspartate, except for that it has an extra carbon in its side chain. So rather than a single CH2, it has two CH2s, and then it's got its carboxylic acid. So now a C double bond O minus, giving us the same sort of behaviors. So we often think about the fact that glutamate and aspartate might act in similar ways in a protein, where they both would act as acids, one just being just slightly larger than the other. And of course, a slight difference in the local electronic environment because of the length of that R group. But just like aspartate, we know that glutamate is going to be water loving to the max. It's going to love forming those ion dipole interactions with water, making it very highly hydrophilic. It too will carry a negative charge at physiological pHs well above its pKa. This time, the dicarboxylic acid is an alpha gamma carboxyl group that gives it that dicarboxylic acid nature. So we've now met diamino and dicarboxylic acids. The last two today that we're going to cover are asparagine and glutamine. These are the amide derivatives of the acidic amino acids, and of course that means we know that we're going to have a C double bond O bond and H3, and so, or NH2. So recognize that that's just the amide bond added into the R group. Otherwise, asparagine looks just like aspartate, only it's got the amide instead of the acid. So it's just going to be CH2 bond C double bond O bond NH2. Very polar and fairly water loving, but not the same kind of strength of water loving as aspartate has, because it's got just polar bonds rather than the charged. And let's go ahead and write in glutamine while we're at it, and because we recognize that, like glutamate and its relationship to aspartate, there's simply two CH2s prior to the amide group. Glutamine, asparagine. And both glutamine and asparagine are, of course, going to be water loving. They're polar, hydrophilic, often found on the surface of proteins, where they can frequently hydrogen bond. and interact with other molecules. In fact, maybe these will be even involved if a protein is perhaps binding to a receptor. So in both cases, polar hydrophilic. Now, before we leave this page behind, I want to tell you about something pretty familiar. You may not have thought about it, but you actually are pretty familiar with the amino acid glutamate, even just within popular culture, because oftentimes glutamate will interact with a cation, sodium, the sodium plus cation. And if you think about this, this is a single sodium interacting with a glutamate, monosodium glutamate, or MSG. And MSG is really quite talked about, quite a lot, a little bit notorious.